Hi everyone. The title of this paper is Representational Style Shifts Due to a Pandemic, MP's Adjustments to COVID-19. I'm Kelly Blidook, and this is a paper that I wrote with Koop, who's at the University of Manitoba. And this is part of an ongoing research project that we've been doing, looking at the representational activities of MPs, not just in Canada, but in some other countries as well. And we decided along the way, because of the pandemic, that we would collect some data related to it. So that's what this paper is attempting to do. First of all, just thinking about representation and the topic of representation, we kind of start from the standpoint of thinking about Hannah Pitkin's work. We think about how representation is often broken down into sort of standing or acting for constituents by representatives. But we sort of expand that using Richard Fenno and others, sort of think of representation not simply as outcomes. There is a loop that Pitkin talks about, and others have kind of expanded on this to the point where we don't always think about representation in terms of, is there an outcome that can be kind of pointed to, a particular policy that people wanted, or a certain person in place who somehow represents, but more so to think of representation as a series of connections that incorporate communication, incorporate action, and ideally they lead us towards a form of trust in a relationship. And so we sort of are expanding on this by thinking about representational styles. Again, this comes significantly from Richard Fenno's work. Basically what we think and what we've argued in 2018 in a book that we also wrote with Heather Bastido is that MPs tailor their representational styles through a relative emphasis on 4 different types of connections. We think that MPs engage in policy connections with their constituents. We think that they engage in service connections, aiding them, helping them with things. We think that they engage in symbolic connections, simply being present, being part of the community, showing themselves to be available. And finally, they engage in party connections. They engage primarily with the members or with the active party within the constituency. And those middle 2 will be the most significant when we start to think about changes that we've seen during the pandemic. And of course, based on sort of the representational connections framework that we lay out, there are sort of 3 primary causes or factors in affecting the types of styles that MPs adopt. Typically, we think of the constituency context as being significant. The who, the nature of the constituency, who's in it, whether it's urban, rural, what sorts of demands are being made based on that constituency. We think about the MP's own goals, what it is that they are involved in politics for and what they're trying to accomplish. And we also think about experiential learning. So in the job of being an MP, how do MPs adapt? How do they take in new information and new circumstances and perhaps change their styles accordingly? Well, we think that due to COVID-19, the pandemic was essentially a shock that primarily affected constituency context. This is seen in both the regulations, the sorts of things that people can do. Think of social distancing, think of the need to communicate remotely, and also in terms of the demands that would come, that these things both changed for MPs and therefore changed the nature of their work. I remember sitting down a little over a year ago, chatting with Royce, my co-author here, and saying, well, what exactly are MPs doing right now? And we didn't really know. I mean, you could certainly guess about it, but we thought, well, we should actually ask them. We should try to get them to describe as best they can what they're doing now and what they're doing differently than they would have otherwise. And so we think that when those regulations and demands change that come through the constituency context, then in turn the representational styles will change. And along with that, we may also see that there is some experiential learning that goes on. So MPs are adaptive. They're taking in information around them to try to do things as effectively as they can. And so there's probably some learning components here too. And so I think this sort of leads into the 3 different areas that we wanted to kind of look at. Of those 4 types of connections that I listed, the policy, the service, the symbolic, and the party, do we find that there's a greater emphasis on certain types of connections and less on others? Beyond that, do we see that there's a change in the nature of those connections? So not just is there more of a given type of connection, but if we can get more qualitative about it, what is it about that connection? Is it being done differently than it was previously? And finally, when we think about bringing in experiential learning, we don't necessarily think that the constituency context will change in the long term because of the pandemic? It might, but more so, did it cause some kind of learning, some kind of adaptations that MPs then sort of change their styles in the long term as a result of them? So those are the three things that we now want to kind of look at. The data that we use for this, as I said, this is part of an ongoing project, and we actually did do some observational work as part of this project, but this is actually data that we're presenting now is all from interviews. We haven't spent any time with MPs during the pandemic, but we were engaged in a series of interviews that we felt would be, we didn't expect the pandemic to actually affect. At the beginning of all this, we thought that the interviews would just carry on through the year. Then a pandemic came along. So we actually have a handful of interviews that were done before the pandemic really hit, and then most of them were conducted during it. And so this is MPs from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. We also undertook a small series of interviews immediately when the pandemic was clear, when we knew there was an opportunity. We actually published a research note. We kind of looked and said, well, we should actually be asking specifically, what is it that MPs are doing right now, and have some COVID-specific interviews. So we do have 11 of those as well. And so I'm drawing from data from both of those. But if you're familiar with the research note that we published last year, you'll recognize some of the same content that was also in that note from those 11 MPs simply in Canada. So first of all, just thinking about the types of connections. Is there more or less of certain types? And the first one we'll point at here is service connections. One MP said, I think the amount of legislative work we're doing has not really diminished. It's pretty much the same, except we're also doing an influx of constituency work, a volume of constituency work that's increased quite dramatically. And this increase is something that was relatively consistent across interviews. Most MPs who would speak about how life had changed in both of these sets of interviews tended to say similar sorts of things. So another MP told us, I reckon the volume of correspondence and requests for assistance probably quintupled through that period. Another said, my casework has gone up 3 times and we haven't got more people to help. People were really, really frightened. So most MPs were giving us some indication that the caseload, that the need for service connections was greater. Others told us that they were actually taking on slightly different work. They were also using the phones. They were taking on work that sometimes just their constituency staff would do. They also talked about bringing in their parliamentary staff to sort of help with those calls, with all of the requests they were getting for service. We also saw some variation in terms of symbolic connections too. So one MP said, I need to have coffee with, I need to talk to, I need to shake hands with constituents, stakeholders, and colleagues. Another said, with COVID-19 at the moment, I'm not standing in shopping centers 10 times a month, I'm not door knocking 2,000 houses a month, and now I actually feel that I can't represent them as well because I don't know them as well, because I've lost touch with them. So what we're seeing here is some variation as well in symbolic connections, that what MPs would normally do symbolically, the presence that they would have, their means of just being present and seeing the community, that these were lessened. And so we can kind of look at the types generally and say, okay, so we do see some variation in 2 specific types of connections. There appears to be an increase in service connections, and there appears to be a decrease in symbolic connections. We can then go on and look a little bit at the nature of these connections. So some MPs talked about sort of proactive service connections. They talked about calling. They even sometimes would lay out, well, first we called these sorts of people, and then we called these sorts of people. We want to kind of work through our communities and ensure they were all being dealt with, that they all had what they needed. And so they talk about calling the elderly, and then they talk about calling families, helping with school issues. Some MPs talked about buying radio ads to ensure that people knew that they could call, that they were there and available for them. One MP actually spoke to informally counseling people. A number talked about the headspace, the mental space that a lot of people were in, and that they required sort of some form of talking to or some form of counseling. In some cases, they were also able to advise for formal counseling. And then finally, MPs speak to using new communications tools. So I think probably the most obvious one here, and the one that I think most of us are familiar with, the fact that we're having a conference the way that we're having it, that we're getting used to new communications tools as a means of still trying to do the same work. And so one MP actually said, and the last few weeks was really about many of our old people who were on their own. It was just company. And some of those phone calls lasted 30 to 45 minutes because, and then there was an interruption, people just wanted to talk. And the MP replied, yes, they needed someone to talk to. So the staff worked really, really hard at keeping those community connections going. I apologize for the length of this quote, but I think this is also kind of an interesting illustration of the importance that when we change to new communications tools, how representation can be negatively affected by it. So this MP said, I've not been able to do an advice surgery in a public building since March. And one of the things that concerns me about that isn't from an electoral advantage point of view, but it's the fact that I've got a very vulnerable constituency and quite a lot of very vulnerable constituents as well. I've got the highest number of asylum seekers, so that's people who've fled, war, famine, sexual violence. So I've got the highest number of asylum seekers in Scotland living in my constituency. So these are people who don't have a lot of money. Many of these people wouldn't have access to things like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. A lot of constituents who perhaps haven't come from a very professional background, who aren't perhaps used to writing formal emails and letters. And therefore, if they have a problem with a benefit or they have a problem with a housing arrangement, they wouldn't feel as confident or as eloquent expressing that to their local housing association or the benefits agency. And so what they'll do is they'll come to me and they'll ask me to write a letter on their behalf. This MP is illustrating one of the big issues that can come along with this significant change, which is that there are people who cannot be as well served by it. They feel that there are gaps that they can't effectively fill with the communication tools that they have, and because people can't come in person. So one MP, also just getting at the nature of the change as it has occurred for all of us, said it's upside down. It's not all those things like we used to do, visiting and, pressing the flesh, as the expression goes. All that is gone. It's out. It's a virtual world that I'm living in. And so we can kind of see from this second section that we know that the nature of the service and the symbolic connections was qualitatively different than the form of symbolic and service connections that were conducted previously. Now, is there some long-term implications here? I think to the extent that we see these, and of course this is a little bit more of guesswork, but this is still partly based on what people told us. The communications is what's different. People are using different communications tools. Is there some long-term impact of that? One MP said, there's a lot of things about this COVID pandemic that will maybe change the way that I do the job in the future. And this is Terence Rogers, a Liberal MP. He's noted in the research note that we published last year. He says, to leave my home and drive to Grand Bank, it's like 4 hours. So if they, mayors and municipal councillors, want a meeting about a particular issue, my executive assistant and I can set up a Zoom meeting. And we can spend extra time in the meeting because we know we don't have to spend 8 hours driving. Another MP said, sitting in my office compared to a meeting at the end of a drive where I actually go, there's no comparison. But no, like everyone, I'm sure we'll find ways of being more efficient with online meetings, but not to the degree that it will really change what you do as a local MP in your community. And so we can kind of see that some MPs frame this adaptation as losing touch, this idea that they communicate differently, but others see it as having a long-term benefit. And most implied, of course, this is interviews. It's hard to imagine somebody arguing otherwise, but most implied this will change how they connect in the future as remote communications are incorporated, but implied that they would also be able to do as good a job. Essentially, that people wouldn't fall through the cracks, that they would find ways to adapt and use this. One MP suggested they'd change most of their meetings 50% or so to online, but they would still have the in-person meetings as they used to. And so our conclusions here are simply that there is variation in constituency context and probably some experiential learning, and that these lead to changes in the relative focus on certain connection types, but also the nature of those connections. And then it's possible that there are some long-term implications for this upon representational styles. So thank you very much for listening to our talk today, and we definitely look forward to any questions that people have.